ecosystems. My contribution to this webinar will be brief on a brief reflection on the question, why are we doing this actually? It's a lot of work, and maybe we should be able to take sensible decisions without going through all this effort. So I want to briefly reflect on that. And maybe before going into the present and the future, Iska, can you show the next slide? It's always good to put the present into perspective. So a little bit of history here. Early thinking about this need for taking better account of the economic importance of nature started somewhere around the mid-1970s, probably inspired by the landmark report on the limits to growth in 1972, I think. And late in the 1970s, an organization was created called the Association of Environmental and Resource Economics, which tried to incorporate at least some of those so-called externalities, environmental impact like pollution, land degradation, and so on, in the economic system of accounting. A couple of years later, the International Society for Ecological Economics was founded, which went a step further and tried to go beyond actually the more neoclassical way of calculating our GDP, and including also the benefits of protecting nature. So not only incorporating damages, but also the actual so-called free services that we get from nature. And two pioneers in this field were David Pearce from the environmental economic side and Bob Costanza from the ecological economics perspective. Yes, Iska? Then a few years later, Bob Costanza took the initiative to, for the first time, try to quantify that natural capital. And we published a paper in Nature, which was called The Total Value of the World's Ecosystem Services and Natural Capital. But without consulting us as authors, the editorial board put a short title on the cover, calling it Pricing the Planet. And that was actually the last thing we wanted to do. There is a fundamental difference between pricing and valuing something. I have no time to go into details here, but pricing mainly relates to the market value, the exchange value you can get for your, in this case, ecosystem service. Valuation is much broader than that and looks at the total utility of something. As you can see at the lower part of the graph, in those days there was still very little attention actually to this topic, very few publications. It picked up a bit after the Nature article, which helped to prepare for what was then to become the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, started in 2000, which is called, well, it was called the Millennium Assessment, to make a global inventory of all those ecosystem services, and mainly concentrating on the biophysical quantification and why ecosystem services are important to our well-being, not so much looking at the economics, which was done a few years later by the TEEP study, yeah, Iska, where, as the name says, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity focused on those economic and monetary values. Yes. Next animation. So at the same time, I see a chat coming by. We will answer that question in a moment, what you can do with the ESVD. Several organizations were created to support this process of better understanding ecosystem services and how to quantify them. The Ecosystem Service Partnership, already mentioned by Vince, and the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, created in 2012, a UN-based organization like IPCC on climate change, but then for ecosystem services and biodiversity. Yes. In the same year, the journal Ecosystem Services was launched, and as you can see in the blue graph, it led to an enormous increase in publications on the topic. Yes. and that is still continuing. This graph stops in 2016, but that same trend is still visible. And just last year, IBES published a report on the diverse values and valuation of nature, emphasizing that it's a kind of a combination of biophysical, economic, monetary, and socio-cultural and relational values. Yes, next slide. So why put a monetary value on nature? It has partly been answered by Franc already in his presentation, and I think this little cartoon is quite illustrative that, yes, next. Sorry for all the animations. We often only realize what the true value of something to our personal life or to our economy is after we have lost it. So that is why it is so important to better understand those values before you cut down the forest or deplete your resources or do other kind of things to the planet, which is still ongoing, as the Dasgupta review showed that came out about 2 years ago about the economics of biodiversity, which confirmed that we are basically still plundering the planet, meaning we're using it without actually paying for the damage that we cause, mainly due to so-called outdated economics. And I think Vince also mentioned the issue that by doing so, we basically live at the expense of the livelihood and health of poor people and future generations. And just last year, the WWF released their Living Planet report, confirming, unfortunately, once again, that biodiversity loss is actually still increasing, not decreasing. An estimated 1 million species will be lost in the next 30 years or so, which means we are losing one species every 20 minutes, more or less. And most of them we will never have come to know, and also not their importance possibly to our well-being. Causes are, of course, things like climate change, land degradation, pollution, and so on, all human-made problems that are causing a lot of damage by themselves. Yes, next slide. And costing a lot of money. The economics of land degradation community, also an international organization looking at, as the name says, the economics of land degradation, and they calculated that we're losing about $6 to $10 trillion per year in terms of all those lost ecosystem services. Now, those big numbers in themselves might not mean that much, but that's around 10% of global GDP, which I think is a lot of money that we could have used in a much more sensible way than just using it to pay for damages caused by unsustainable economic system. Next slide. So we urgently need to change that economic system. A statement already made in 2005 by Pavan Sukhdev at the start of the TEEP study. Yes, next slide. Fortunately, slowly things are changing in that direction. We know all the fair trade products and organic labels that we have. If we go to the supermarket, we can make that choice. Unfortunately, usually those more environmental and social sustainable products are more expensive than the regular conventional produced product. An organization called True Pricing is trying to change that and calculate what actually the true price or fair price should be. And here's an example from a product in Dutch supermarket, paprika or peppers from Spain. The normal price is 4.7 euro per kilogram, but if you add just climate impact and social cost, it would be 4.95 euro, which is 5% more. And if you would add even more of those ecosystem services and other externalities, I'm pretty sure the fair price would be even more. And this is not fictive money. Somebody is really paying that difference, and somebody, that's all of us, through our taxes and even health and other environmental costs. Next slide, or not next slide, the next animation. Many or most companies are actually very willing to charge that fair price and start producing more sustainable, but they need what they call a level playing field. And that's also more and more being acknowledged. And I was very pleased when 2 years ago the UN Statistical Office released the next version of the System of Environmental and Economic Accounting that underpins how we calculate our GDP. including ecosystem accounting, basically taking better account of those ecosystem services. There is a 2-minute video that explains all that much better than I can, actually. So Iska, can you show that? The video is going, but I don't hear the sound.
They say the best things in life are free. Feeling beach sand on your toes, watching a spectacular sunset, like in the forest. From the clean air we breathe to the food we eat, we've always treated nature's resources as endless and free. Today, we are paying the price with climate change, pollution, and mass extinction. For the past 75 years, we have been measuring our success and well-being in the dollars and cents of the gross domestic product, GDP, while letting nature pick up the tab for our pollution, deforestation, and degradation. This year, we begin to change all that. The UN Statistical Commission is set to adopt a new framework to go beyond GDP and to finally make nature count. With this framework, every country on Earth will be able to measure their natural capital and understand the immense contributions of nature and the importance of protecting it. The framework will help policymakers realize that forests mean more to us when they are healthy, that it makes more sense to protect our planet for tomorrow than to cash out today, and that fresh air, clean water, and a livable climate are not infinite and need our care and protection. Watch closely as we begin to make nature count.
Okay, this apologies for the quality, by the way, of the little video. If you haven't seen it, make sure to have a look at it on your own computer. You can use the link in the PowerPoint. Yes, my last slide is about the data needed to make this happen. It's a very long-term process to come to fair prices and fair calculation of the GDP, our measure of welfare, actually. We started doing this, developing this database already in 2010 as part of the TEEP study mentioned earlier. And after a couple of years, we got additional funding from DEFRA, the UK Department of Environment. Since 2020, we are working together closely with the FAO in various programs. And as mentioned earlier, the Dutch Ministry of Nature and Food Safety is supporting our efforts since 2021. In addition, we are carrying out many different projects. It's used by many different users like the World Bank, Standard & Poor's, FAO I mentioned earlier, Dutch banks, a really important development that the financial institutions are now also getting on board and starting to use the data and many others. With that, I would like to finish my little looking back and looking forward, and Victoria will tell you more about the ins and outs of the database itself. Thanks.
Thank you, Dolf, for your presentation and paving the path and showing where we are coming from and the broader context we are operating in. I think the video is very clear. There's also fitting music with the video, but if you watch it for yourself later after the webinar, you can also hear that. Now we've seen the broader context. We are a bit over time, so now we will take a deep dive into the ESVD, the structure and the content. That's all what you've been coming for. We've been very busy with developing and improving the ESVD. So now I would like to give the floor to a very close colleague of mine, to Victoria, who is also an ESVD program officer and who dedicates a lot of her time on the ESVD. She's fundamental for improving and expanding the ESVD. So Victoria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vince. Well, hello everyone. I hope you can see the screen clearly and hear me well. I would recommend you to click on the PowerPoint so you can see it in the bigger screen. Yeah, so today I'm gonna talk about the latest developments in ESVD, the newest functionalities and their implementation. So yeah, thanks. So more specifically, I would like to discuss ESVD, its database structure, provide you with an overview of the available data, and share the latest improvements we have made to our web interface, which you can access at esvd.net. And also I will provide guidance on how you can access and maximize the use of our platform. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you may already know, the ESVD is a huge database that's free and accessible to everyone. It contains information on the value of ecosystem services and biomes across the world. And the database currently holds over 9,400 records from more than 1,300 studies. And we are quite excited because we are gonna soon reach the milestone of 10,000 estimates. So the database is always growing with frequent updates thanks to the funding we had from several projects that have helped us to increase the number of valuation in the database. So also we have a repository of valuation studies containing over 3,600 studies. And to make it easier for users to compare, over 71% of the data has been standardized to a common set of units for all beneficiaries at 2020 price levels. And to improve data quality, half of the estimates have been reviewed by experts. And in the latest update, we've added 2 new classifications: the CI ecosystem services classification and a modified version of the IUCN biome classification that we call ESVD 2.0 biome classification. Also, we have integrated new functionalities in our online interface, but I will explain them more in detail a bit later. Okay, so first of all, in terms of what information is available within ESVD, it is important to mention that we start with retrieving valuation studies that estimates the value of ecosystem services and quantify that in monetary units. So we get information from individual studies that have looked at individual or multiple ecosystems and try to estimate the value of ecosystem services using primary valuation methods. So after this step, we include the studies in our repository of valuation studies, and we then take those studies and read them and enter the data from each study into the database. After this point, we also have a review process where external reviewers look at the data that is entered in ESVD and check it. So it is important to mention that the values recorded are in original quantities and units in which the value is reported in the study from which we are taking the information. So where possible, and in order to compare the information, the values have been standardized to a common set of units, that is international dollars per hectare per year at 2020 price levels for all beneficiaries at that particular service. Some value records cannot, sorry, the one before. Some value records cannot be standardized to a common set of units because of missing information, but can also contain information for users. That's why we keep them in the database. They can be found in there. Now, next slide, please. Thank you, Iskra. So in this slide, you can see a screenshot of part of the ESVD master file where we work on. So the database organized its value estimates and corresponding data in more than 100 columns that corresponds to different variables. You may think that more than 100 variables can be a lot, but the more information we retrieve from the studies, the better and more reliable the results will be. So the list of variables that you can see on the right of the screen corresponds to the type of information that we extract from each study and include in the ESVD master file. So for coding the variables, we use different classifications. For the biomes and ecosystems, we use the T classification. And since the latest update that we are today presenting, also with what we call the ESVD 2.0. And that, as I mentioned before, it's a modified version of the IUCN typology for biomes and ecosystems. And for ecosystem services, we use the TIP, sizes, and SIA classification. I would like also to mention that we are always working on developing new variables and include new classifications, so this list is always growing. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do we have in the ESVD at the moment? In this slide, you can see the spatial distribution of the value estimates by study site. So as you can see, our studies are distributed across all regions, but there are some regions that are better represented than others. Until now, Europe is a continent with more values, followed by Asia. But Africa, North and South America, and Oceania are also represented. So in general, I think that the global coverage is pretty good, and it is important to consider that some areas of the world doesn't have that much research, and there's still obviously a lot to be done. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of the biomes that are covered in ESVD, we code information for 15 separate biomes, and we have a lot of data for marine ecosystems, especially for coral reefs, but also a lot of estimates for agricultural systems, also coastal systems. That includes a lot of information for mangroves, and as well as forests, especially for tropical and temperate forests. And you can see that for some biomes, the number of estimates becomes relatively low, such as polar, alpine, or subterranean. And I think that this reflects the extent of the economic valuation literature and which biomes have been the focus of valuation studies. Next. Okay, in terms of ecosystem services, this slide shows the number of value estimates per ecosystem service using the TIP classification. So as you can see, we have a lot of information on recreation and tourism services. We also have for provisioning services such as food or raw materials, and existence and bequest values. And of course, as in the previous slides, shows that there's not much information for other ecosystem services which have not received much attention in the economic valuation literature, but it doesn't mean that they are not important. It just means that there are fewer studies. And on the right side, you can see a graph that shows a fairly even representation across all categories. However, cultural and provisioning services are the most commonly found services in the ESVD, followed by regulating. Next. Okay, so I will now present the latest updates on our web interface. These updates were possible thanks to the funding we had from the latest LNV project. So as part of this project, we focused on improving the online data management system, and we did this in two ways. First of all, we integrated two new classifications, the SIA, the ones that I previously mentioned, the SIA Ecosystem Service Classification and the ESVD 2.0 Biomes and Ecosystems Classification. Both new classifications are now included in the web interface. And on the other side, we have also implemented new functionalities in the interface. These functionalities, the previous one, yeah, thanks. These functionalities help us to create a more efficient and simple workflow, but it also helps users' experience. So on the right column, you can see the list of all the functionalities. So we have integrated a new mapping functionality that I will speak about it later on. We have also integrated new filters, and we have adjusted the visible data. We have implemented a new outlier exclusion rule, and we now also have insights on users of the web interface. And to give better administration of the different ESVD versions, we have included reference and version information of the ESVD. And we have also included a textual adjustment, implemented a new grid system, and a new system to upload new data sets. So next slide, please. Okay, so you may be wondering how you can access the web interface and use the latest functionalities. So in order to access the database, you have to create a free account if you haven't done this yet, and log in esvd.net. And when you click on the database, this is what you can see. In this page, you can view your search results, download the database, extract ecosystem services, valuation data, create summary tables, and also suggest studies. And we understand that not all value estimates in the ESVD fit with the context of your work or research. And for this reason, you can search for a specific context using the filters that you can see on the right. And you can filter by biomes and ecosystems, by country, continent, protection status. And you can also filter through the ecosystem services classifications, the evaluation method, and you also have the option of a free text search. Next slide, please. Okay, so thanks to the latest updates, your search results can be shown in two different ways, in a map or in a table. So as I previously mentioned, we have a new functionality, that is the mapping functionality, and it is possible to spatially filter and visually show the different filter combinations. And this functionality represents the data in a new way, as highlights all the ecosystem services valuations that have coordinates. And each pin gives you information on the location, ecosystem type, ecosystem services, and the standardized value. Regarding the table option or the tabular option, the visual output has also a new order, as it was changed to a more logical order, and we have included the new classifications and new variables. I think it is important also to mention that you also have the option of downloading or exporting the file in an Excel format that I guess that for a lot of users can be quite useful. Next slide. Okay, so one of the options you have in our web interface is to get the summary statistics of your search. This can be understood as the average of all standardized values for a combination of a biome and an ecosystem services. And the summary statistics gives you information of the number of valuations, the information for the mean, the median, the standard deviation, and minimum and maximum value for each ecosystem service of the data that you search. I have included a few notes that are important to clarify, as these are value records that refer only to one biome and one ecosystem service. So records with multiple services or multiple biomes are not included in this summary statistics. And the values used for calculations do not use value transfer methods. Also, the summaries of values is for illustrative purpose. They are only to provide an impression of the order of magnitude of the values obtained from the literature, and also to identify data gaps. And it is not recommended to use these values for value transfer, since summary statistics reflects the underlying ecological and socioeconomic context of diverse study sites, but not necessarily it's representative. Okay, so as part of the LNV funded project, we also focus on improving the quality of the data in the SVD. For this, we developed the basic structure of the biome review groups and start developing a new management system. We have created a more robust and system consisting of ecosystem services experts that check the coded data in ESVD before the data is added to the publicly available web interface. I would like to mention that the list of reviewers is not completed. We're still looking for some people, so please, if you are interested in becoming a reviewer, send us an email. And I would also like to finish saying that if you think that your work can be suitable for to be included in ESVD, please send us your work. And thank you, everyone. And I understand that this was a lot of information, so I'm happy to answer any of your questions later on. And now pass it back to Vince. Thanks.
Thank you, Victoria, for your deep dive into the structure and content of the ESVD. Indeed, it was a good amount of information. And there is one question, maybe there's some questions, but maybe the first one would be nice for you to answer. Are sources of data restricted to literature published in English?
No, good question. No, we actually have studies from all the different languages. I think we have quite a lot of studies in Dutch and in Spanish, but obviously most of them comes from, they're written in English, but it's not restricted.
Yeah, it also really depends on kind of our capacity to translate or to include studies. Victoria has Spanish, so she can include Spanish studies. We are working with Philipp Schägner, who will be presenting next, who is German. So there's definitely options. There's another question, but we will get back to that after. Maybe let's go to the next presentation to Philipp. He's an environmental economist working for the German Federal Environmental Agency, the UBA, on the Value Gaps project, and he's also very involved with us. And as mentioned before, with the ESVD, we're really moving from science to practice. It's also a bit related to the question of Magnus before. What are examples of how to use or apply this data? And Philipp will give a bit more insight in that. So Philipp, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Philipp Schägner. I'm an environmental economist working for the German Environmental Agency. And yeah, very happy to be here today in order to shed some light on policy applications of the ESVD. And therefore, I'm briefly going to introduce 4 case studies. Slide, please. So the first case study, protected area designation in East Timor. Please. So this case study dates back to the time when I was still working for the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in 2019. And together with our partner from IUCN and Conservation International, we were asked to consult the East Timor government in order to extend their protected area network to meet the requirements of the Convention of Biological Diversity. So the most important factors were species distribution and definitely conservation costs. But we were asked to shed some light onto the ecosystem service perspective, in particular spatial planning and co-benefit maximization. Slide, please. So it has to be noted that for us that was a pure desktop study, and we had quite limited time and resources to put in. Also, it has to be noted by the time of 2019, the ESVD covered only about half as many evaluations as it covers today. And for East Timor, a relatively data scarce area, we had only 2 evaluations at that point in time in database. Still, the starting point of our analysis, we presented these global summary values. So these mean values for each combination of biome and ecosystem services, and presented us to our local partners. And it resulted in a fruitful discussion. And among one of the things was representativeness. So to what extent are those global mean values representative in order to consult local land use decisions? So the first step we took then is that we tried to regionalize these global mean values by recalculating these value metrics for the combination of each biome and ecosystem service by giving higher weights to valuation studies that were conducted close to East Timor, and close we defined by being either located within East Timor itself, in the bioeco region, or within the geographical region. And thereby we could recalculate these mean values for each combination of biome and ecosystem service, link it to an ecosystem map that we produced for East Timor, and map the values, the ecosystem service values of East Timor. Slide, please. So these valuation metrics can then also be represented in a figure. So here again, the columns represent the biomes and the rows represent the ecosystem services, and as darker the red, as higher the value. And this we link then to the ecosystem map of East Timor, and thereby we could showcase where are high ecosystem service values provided, how much of it is already protected, and how we might be able to change this by extending the protected area network in East Timor. Still, representation was an issue for our study. So again, we engaged in discussion with our local partners, and we decided that we're going to move forward by commissioning a stakeholder survey. Slide, please. And we implemented local language stakeholder survey that was distributed among villages within the region, and people had to judge the importance of different ecosystem services and to what extent these services are provided by different biomes. Both were asked on a Likert scale, and again, we could use the data in order to obtain a value matrix, this time not in terms of monetary values, but in terms of relative importance. We compared both results. For some ecosystem services matched quite well, for others not. Still, it was very important for us in order to introduce the ecosystem service concept into local protected area planning. So ESVD was very helpful us to very quickly derive some science-based ecosystem service value estimate that generated awareness, that allowed us to indicate the order of magnitude of the ecosystem service value, and to strengthen the ecosystem service perspective in nature conservation in East Timor. Slide, please. Next case study. Land use policy consultation in Germany. Slide, please. So we as Uber, the German Federal Environmental Agency, we regularly publish a so-called methodological convention for the assessment of environmental costs. This convention includes standard cost and value factors for various environmental impacts, for example, pollutants, ground sealing, noise, and others. And it's supposed to be used for public and private decision-making, for example, cost-benefit analysis, project appraisals, accounting, and sustainability reporting. Slide, please. Currently, we're working on a major revision of the methodological convention with various partners. And among other things, we aim at introducing value factors for land use change and biodiversity impact. So what we want to establish is a ready-to-use valuation database for Germany that can be directly used for benefit transfer. And for the benefit transfer, we also want to transfer across space and scales and adjust the transfer values to the site-specific circumstances. So accounting for environmental quality, substitutes, income, and the groups of beneficiaries. Slide, please. So basically what we do is, the starting point currently, we update the ESVD to produce something that we call ESVD Germany. So have all the relevant valuation studies for Germany in place. Based on this updated database, we then want to estimate new value factors for different land uses and ecosystem services. We also want to establish transfer factors that allows us to adjust the transfer values to the site-specific circumstances. These transfer factors are estimated by regression analysis. Therefore, we develop geostatistical models that allows us to intra and extrapolate the primary valuations across space. This is illustrated by this little figure where you have these blue spots where primary valuations have been conducted, and then those values are transferred to all the green areas. That's where no primary data is available for, and where we want to transfer the values to. The models then contain certain sets of variables, most importantly site variables that describe the study site and context variables that describe the context of the study site, and those variables allows them to adjust the transport values to the site-specific circumstances of any site of interest. Slide, please. Case study 3. ABC map, adaptation, biodiversity, carbon mapping tool funded by FAO. Slide, please. The work we conduct under the methodological convention builds up on past work that has just been finished. So by FAO, we have been asked to create a value transfer function that looks at intensive land uses only, but at a global scale. So what we did is we updated the ESVD. We added about 250 new values that are relevant for intensive land users. We then run a meta-regression analysis, and this estimated model then allows us to account for site and context-specific characteristics of the study sites. An important input here was GIS. So we use GIS data layers as explanatory variables in the models, and thereby we could make predictions with our model all across space, so for any location of interest. The estimated value function is about to introduce to the ABC map browser so that you can online assess what is the ecosystem service value at a specific location, and also run scenario analysis if you change some of the explanatory variable values. Slide, please. So this is just an impression. So if you run this regression analysis, then you get these so-called regression tables. The first column provides the explanatory variables that we used, followed by the parameter estimates that indicate to what extent the ecosystem service value changes if the related explanatory variable changes. For sure, you might not be able to read that, but therefore I zoom in. Slide, please. Yeah. So just to give an example, for example, on the top of the table, you can see that irrigated cropland tends to generate higher ecosystem service value as compared to the baseline land cover. Slide, please. And here at the lower part of the table, you can see, for example, that the share of protected areas in a certain key surrounding of the study site also tends to generate higher ecosystem service values. If you look at the last row, or if you look at the first row here from the zoom, you can see that alien species, by contrast, tend to reduce the value of the provided ecosystem services. Slide. Yeah. So ESVD was very important for this board, or is very important for these two studies. First of all, it represents the primary data input in terms of primary evaluation studies, and also for the new data that we added and are about to add, it provides us a data structure that allows us to easily code new data and have it in a comparable manner at a global scale. Last case study, systematic environmental economic accounting, SEER. Slide, please. So the SEER protocol has been adopted by UN Statistical Commission just recently and is currently implemented all around the world. So SEER represents a complementary welfare measure as compared to traditional GDP measures, and it's supposed to demonstrate the contribution of nature to the economy and people. There's this so-called SEER cascade that is currently implemented by countries all around the world. So countries first have to assess the ecosystem extent, then the ecosystem condition. From there, they have to quantify in biophysical terms the ecosystem service flow and use. And this ecosystem service flow and use then has to be valued in monetary terms. And that's where ESVD again comes into play. So giving the time and cost of primary evaluation studies, it's not feasible to conduct such primary evaluation studies all around the world, and consequently we have to conduct value transfer, and there ESVD again provides the relevant data to estimate those value functions and to account for the spatial conditions and also for the different welfare measures that are used in different valuation studies. Slide, please. So how to use ESVD for SEER has also been described in a paper we recently published in One Ecosystem. So if you're interested, please have a look. Slide. That's it from my side. Yeah, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to receive questions, and I'm also looking forward to a fruitful discussion later on.
Thank you, Philipp, for your presentation and for visually pleasing presentation, I would say, and also spatially explicitly showing some of the applications of the ESVD, in this case, more on the valuation and how that fits with conservation for high value areas, in case of the GRC. We have seen some questions coming in. I would suggest that we move first to Luke, to the final presentation, and then we can take the questions one by one. We can give the opportunity to some people from the audience to voice their questions, and then we can get back to the questions. So I will give the word to Luke Brander, who's an environmental economist with affiliations to the VU University, to IVM, and to the University of Leibniz in Hanover. And Luke will give a bit of an outlook into the near future, some of the barriers and opportunities.
Okay, thanks, Vince. Yeah, I just prepared a few slides, partly in anticipation that you would already be quite overloaded with details by now, and also in anticipation of my colleagues overrunning their time, but they haven't actually done it as much as I expected. But so I just have a few slides on the challenges and opportunities for the future. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of challenges, I organized these into challenges related to the data itself and challenges related to funding. So in terms of the data, one of the challenges that we have is this flood of numbers. So the sheer volume of primary valuation studies that we would like to include in the ESVD, Victoria showed or mentioned that was something like 3,600 primary valuation studies that we collected, and we keep in a repository, but we haven't yet read and analyzed, interpreted, and coded in the database. So essentially, we have a lot of information still waiting to enter the ESVD, and there are more being published every day, every week, more primary valuation studies being produced. So it's a bit of a luxury problem, but we have for people building a database, but essentially there's a lot of information to process, and we have to make a decision about which of that information we pick up and we enter first. A second challenge related to the data is in terms of the quality control, and this actually has two aspects. One is the quality of the underlying data that we're inputting, so the primary valuation studies themselves are of varying quality in the way they've been implemented and the methods they've used. And we have something of a challenge in terms of interpreting that quality and recording information about study quality and certainty of valuation estimates in the database. That's one side of it. The other side of the quality control challenge is for the work we do ourselves when we read, interpret, and code a study. That's often studies very complex, difficult to necessarily interpret in exactly the right way, and so there's also a quality control step for ourselves. And the third challenge I put here for related to data is to do with representation, which has been mentioned a few times before. Victoria showed a few nice figures and the map of where the data is coming from. And of course, some areas, parts of the world, and some ecosystem services and some biomes are better represented in the data than others. This partly reflects, as Victoria said, the underlying availability of prime valuation research, but also on the interests of our funders, where we've received money to add extra data. Of course, those areas are better represented. There was a question in the chat just now about studies for Peru. So apparently we have relatively few value estimates for Peru, and yet there are apparently a large number of studies available, which is great. We would definitely like to include them to increase our representation of Peru in particular, Latin America in general. But that's one of the challenges that we face in the data. Also, the language issue is that we're restricted by the language we can speak and read. So there might be very good valuation studies available that we'd like to include. We just don't speak the language. And then the second group of challenges that I identified was to do with funding. So so far, and Dolf mentioned this, funding for the ESVD has come on a project-by-project basis. So the first thing to say is a very big thank you to all of the organizations and projects that have funded the development of the ESVD. So that includes DEFRA, LNV, of course, the Selena project, FAO, and several others. So of course that funding has been extremely useful, but since it's a project-by-project basis with their own interests, it makes it a little bit challenging for us to employ staff and to add as much data as perhaps we would like, and to develop the functionality and the details of the database. So related to that is, we want to basically make a continuous process of adding data to keep the database as up to date as possible, and also improving the database itself and also the web functionality that Victoria showed earlier. So I think we're making progress with that, but it's funding limited. So when we get more money, we can add more functionalities. We have our kind of wish list of things we would like to do, particularly with the ESVD.net web interface, perhaps that add a value transfer tool to that. But that'll hopefully be in the next phase of funding. And very importantly, I think is the need for funding to keep access to ESVD free. Currently, it's publicly available to everybody, which we think is very important. The whole idea is that this information should be available to everybody to inform decision making and improve decision making. But that does require some funding. Okay, next slide, please. Thanks. So then, in terms of future opportunities, I've divided that in two as well. First of all, related to data, and second, in the next slide, related to future support for the ESVD. So in terms of future opportunities for the database itself, well, we see quite a lot of opportunities to expand the ESVD in multiple directions. One is in terms of the number of value observations, the value estimates included. There's a lot more to add, and also improve the representation, like I mentioned before. That we can ideally improve in terms of the geographic coverage, the coverage of ecosystems and biomes and ecosystem services. Another direction that we would like to expand the ESVD is not just adding rows to the database, new valuation estimates, but also columns. So more information about each of the value estimates included in the database. So areas we'd like to include information on would be on the value concept that's measured, and this is particularly relevant for the application of the information from the ESVD to ecosystem accounting applications, for which there's a need to just only use exchange values that have been estimated and not welfare values. So it would be useful to include then information about the value concept that each valuation estimate measures. Another area we'd like to add information is on the specific change that's being valued. So I think increasingly so in the valuation literature, studies measure a value for a specified change in the provision of an ecosystem service. This could be in terms of change in area, condition, flow of service. And include information on that in the ESVD in a text field. But using that information is difficult to quantify what the change that's being valued is. And I think, that's one area that we can expand the database in terms of information, in terms of a categorical description of the value change. And another area that we'd like to add the information is on ecosystem condition. For the moment, we've tried this, but information from the underlying studies often don't describe very well the condition the ecosystem that's being valued. And it's partly because economists don't understand or describe well ecosystem condition. And so that's an area that needs improvement, and we're looking at ways of doing that. And finally, a third direction to expand the database, which Philipp already mentioned a little bit about, is the possibility of adding spatially referenced data to the data included in the ESVD. So we have a location of each of the study sites in the ESVD. And with that, we can add spatially referenced data from globally available secondary data sources to provide more context information and perhaps information about ecosystem condition into the database. And this is something we're currently doing with FAO and for their ABC map tool. And then the next area that we're thinking, you know, was maybe, sorry, the previous slide, yeah. An area possible, maybe, you know, we're thinking about the possibility of, or the feasibility of looking at AI supported data development. So there's a lot of interest in AI at the moment, of course, but could we use AI in some way to help us to build a database? It's a very laborious process that Victoria described of, you know, reading a study, coding the data, checking it. And if we can possibly use AI in some way to at least maybe for the relatively easy pieces of information to extract from a study and enter into the database structure, and perhaps leave the more complex interpretation of the valuation process and method to a real person. But even some level of automated processing of the data, building of the data would already be an improvement. And finally, on this slide, it's already been mentioned, the need for data review. And yeah, there's still some way to go to what we would like is to have all of the data reviewed by an external expert to ensure the correct interpretation and coding of the data. And this is an ongoing process, also supported by LNV and by our colleagues in the Ecosystem Services Partnership, and others have been helping to do this. Okay, next slide, please. The final slide I have is in terms of future opportunities, is about future support. So not just financial, not funding, but also in-kind support. And I think this is looking quite positive, and particularly because there's such increasing demand for information about the value of ecosystem services. We see this through several different initiatives and policy processes that have been mentioned earlier, and I list some of them here. One, of course, is interest in natural capital accounting, the CEA, interest in ecosystem restoration. It's the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration. There's also a lot of demand for information on the value of ecosystem services to appraise nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction and climate change. And we also have processes like the Convention on Biological Diversity, and they're setting targets for expanding protected areas, which again requires information to make the economic case or the economic appraisal of where and how to expand protected areas. And one of the areas that we're kind of increasingly working on, and which demand for information on the value of ecosystem services has really expanded a lot in recent years, is from the private sector, from business and finance. So to report, but also to get an understanding of dependencies and impacts on ecosystem services. And yeah, I see this as one of the areas which is really going to drive a lot of demand for value information and for the ESVD. Finally, one of the opportunities for support comes from you, or from the users. So Victoria mentioned this already, but we would like it if users, of course, suggest their own valuation studies or studies they're aware of that we should include in the ESVD. Also, please get involved in reviewing the data. There's a lot of work to do there. And a third area for user involvement is for you to provide example policy applications of where the information from the ESVD has been used. I think this is kind of inspiring for us as the ESVD team to see where the data is used, how it's used, but also more importantly, inspiration for others to use the ESVD data in policy applications. Okay, thanks very much, and back to Vince.
Thanks, Luke, for outlining some of the chances, the opportunities, but also some of the challenges. I think this is really nicely closing the circle. I think before we should go into the questions, maybe just first some very shortly some takeaways. So Iskra, if you can go to the next slide. Yeah, and then we're going to switch it around. Yeah. So of course, just to start, very thanks everybody for coming, for being also active. We will get back to your questions, but maybe just very shortly on the takeaways and the call for action before everybody is already out. So the main takeaways: we have been growing a lot since 3 or 4 years ago, starting with the DEFRA update that we had. So there's a lot of demand, and we see this, and we try to tap into this with the new data, including new data, but also tapping into these scientific opportunities, for example, value transfer functions, as Luke shortly mentioned, and also how do we link to the scientific community? So how do we tie closer together with reviewers that help us with the data, but also vice versa, and that we can also pinpoint in directions. So this is areas where we might need some additional data, etc. And then also closely linked to the presentation of Philipp, so application into different forms of decision making. So how can we inform policies for protection of nature, for conservation, for integration into some payment for ecosystem services standards, to all kind of focus on placing nature on the balance sheet again. And that's slowly becoming reality in different forms and different speeds, I would say. And maybe one final that ties into the close to the call for action, but to keep the data open source, what Luke also mentioned. We are very thankful, of course, for LNV, DEFRA, others for their support with the ESVD, and we need to work together to make nature count, to secure this open access to for as far as we know, the largest freely available database with monetary values. And we need this type of governmental, national or supranational projects in our shared responsibility to do better and to bring nature into decision making. So this also closely tied to our call for action. As Frank van der Steen also mentioned in his introduction, we would like to get in contact with other governments, also to specifically discuss ways to collaborate and keep the data freely available, possibly in collaboration with the Dutch government. And close to this, creating stronger ties with the scientific community in the field of ES valuation, to have more collaboration, to have more interaction, and to kind of learn together. And with that, I would say, you can get in contact with us. You can see our email addresses below. We will also share them in the chat. And we will also share the presentation and the recording. And with having said that, I would say we can move back to the questions. Question time. Maybe I will just pick some of the questions in the chat, and I will read them out, and we can go over some of them. So maybe start with the one from Ali on the University of Genova, about the NUTS levels and kind of the spatially explicitness of the data. Maybe I'll just shortly answer, and if anybody has any additions, please go for it. We don't have yet explicit links. What we have in the ESVD is how we have information on coordinates. So we have point coordinate information or point location information. We also have information on the site area and kind of the level of the valuation. So is it a valuation on a local level, so very small scale, or on a regional level, or on a national or even supranational level? For example, studies on the Amazon region if you have a big willingness to pay study, it covers the whole Amazon, which covers multiple countries. So it's difficult there to have kind of point locations and to make them in a way spatially explicit. Then there was a question by Stefanos. I think it was during the presentation of Philipp. And the question is, what are some examples of context variables? So Philipp, if you would be able to answer that question. I think it was during your presentation, during the GRC example, if I'm correct.
Yeah. So we distinguish between variables that describe the site itself, and then in the other part are context variables that describe the surrounding of the site. So that would be, for example, the availability of substitutes, also socioeconomic characteristics of the catchment populations, complementary goods that might be located in the proximity of the site.
Thanks, Philipp, for your answer. And maybe related to this, we have also been working together with the FAO on these value transfer functions, where we also look at context variables. So maybe, Luke, if you want to elaborate a bit on this, because it's related to the question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's as Philipp said, so what we're looking at there in terms of context characteristics is the surrounding area of a study site, the valued ecosystem, and other variables that might explain variation in value. So as Philipp said, that could be in terms of availability of substitute sites, distances to population centers, perhaps disturbances, so maybe measures of nighttime light or roads, accessibility, things like that.
All right, thank you. Then there was a question from Livia Maria Costa Madureira about the SIA, the System of Environmental Economic Accounting. And the SIA entails exchange values, so maybe a good idea would be to create well-being accounts. That is also in line with the discussion on gross domestic product in the statistical national accounts and the limitations there. I think that's a very interesting question. We are also in a bit of a debate sometimes on how to deal with these these welfare versus exchange values. So maybe I would give this question to Luke or Dolf or Philipp.
Yeah, this is quite a big question, potentially a big debate. So I think the CEA process, which is really sticking within the boundaries of this SNA process, it's good. I mean, it basically takes it a step further to add information about the value of ecosystem services to that, strict definitions. Of course, looking at it from a welfare perspective, takes a broader perspective of the values of those services, and I think there's also good reasons to also develop accounts that reflect that. But that's another big undertaking. But potentially, in terms of the ESVD, we have information in the ESVD that would feed into both of those types of accounts. That's one of the strengths of the ESVD.
Maybe I can add to that.
Yeah.
Quickly. Because indeed, these are all kind of ongoing developments. It also relates to this question about gross ecosystem products somebody else asked. So for the moment, these are all initiatives that are going on in parallel. And my hope is that eventually it will all come together somehow, that the GDP calculations will be expanded and being more open to not only exchange values. And it is happening already a little bit with carbon sequestration, for example. 20 years ago, nobody even thought about that as an ecosystem service. And with climate change, we started realizing it is an important ecosystem service. And now with the system of carbon credits, it actually is quite easily to incorporate it in more conventional GDP calculations. And I think there are other ecosystem services that could be incorporated in the more conventional GDP calculations. At the same time, SEEA, when they launched this ecosystem accounting system, we were partly, Luc and myself, actually engaged in some of the discussions around it, did include quite a substantial number of those ecosystem services. So I am hopeful, actually, that we are more and more getting closer to come to two well-being type of indicator for how we are doing as a society and economy. But maybe I'm too optimistic here.
Thanks, Dolf. Maybe just shortly on that, the gross ecosystem product. That's a very interesting question. Dolf also already replied to it, but shortly to mention that we are together with Wageningen Economic Research, actually have just started a project on this gross ecosystem product and how to integrate this into macroeconomic modeling. So if you want to know more about this, I would say reach out to us, maybe to Mieke Siebers, and we can discuss. So we are actually looking into this currently, and we're doing a project on it. I see it's almost time. There was a question from Helen Wallace, maybe for Victoria. What is the extent of geographical/global representation in the ESVD, and could this be improved? It's a big question.
Good question. I think somebody has answered in the comments, but yeah, Europe has clearly the favorite in the database. And also I would like to mention, because I was now checking, that Magnus Tuvental has used the filters for Europe and says that it's getting 81 studies. There might be an error because I just filter, and I have 2,995 studies for Europe. So just check check the filters, because there might be an error there. So yeah, the special distribution of study sites, Europe has 32%, Asia 24%, and we mainly focus on these areas because basically most of our funding came from the sites where we have to focus on. But we are more than happy to, obviously, to increase the number of value estimates for other areas. For example, for the LNB project, this last year, we decided to focus on South America and Africa because we didn't have much more information for these regions. So yeah.
Thank you. I think we are also running out of time. I think that most questions have been replied to, and if not, I would say that we will get back to them via email because we all have them saved up. Then I would, unless maybe there's anyone else from the team who really wants to answer a specific question. Then I would like to wrap up. Yeah, thanks all for coming, for joining this webinar. I hope it was suited to your needs and to your interests. I hope you have some better insights in the ESVD, our newest updates on the data, but also how you can really use it in different types of public or private decision making. I hope that at least some of your thoughts and questions also have been addressed. And I think together, this is the ESVD is always in momentum. There's a lot of drive behind it in the team. And I think together, also outside the team with your collaborations, we can make next steps in making nature count. So thank you for joining. And we hope to
maybe one brief remark. If you want to stay in touch, sign up with the Ecosystem Service Partnership. I put the website in the chat. Quite easy, Ecosystem Service Partnership. If you type it in Google, you'll get there. So hope to see you at some point somewhere during the ESP meetings.
Yes, there's a conference in Chile, which Dolf also mentioned in the email, in the chat. So if you have the time and if it's of your interest, please sign up. Thank you. Bye-bye. stop the recording now also, actually.